Hi, John.
Hey, Lizette. Looks like we've started.
Yes, we are ready.
Great.
Um,
And I see we have some attendees on, so I think we're ready to start presenting.
I'm looking for the translating. Just a second.
Sure. Folks, bear with us for a second while we get the translation set up. Should take just a moment.
Oh, John, I think it's on your end. Do you see the little globe? Because you're the host.
When I logged in, it told me I was not the host.
Okay.
But I am the host now. Yes, I see it changed.
Okay.
Let me see if I can find it. Give me just a second.
Yes. Yep. And I'll make the announcement in Spanish. Si ocupan traducción al español, hay un globo abajo en su pantalla donde le puede seleccionar para escuchar en español. Gracias.
I couldn't find that, so I passed hosting to you because maybe you'd be faster than me, and then you can pass it back to me.
I think it's on. I don't see Ricardo. Ricardo, are you there? Mm,
He is in the attendee queue.
and I think we are good.
Okay, thanks, Lizette.
Mhm.
All right. Well, my name's John Alden, and I'm the director of IOLERO. We're going to start our annual report for 2024-2025 Town Hall. I am noticing that we have half a dozen or so attendees who are all people that are pretty much regulars at a lot of our appearances, and I'm guessing some of you have probably seen our annual report already and or our annual report presentation at the Board of Supervisors. And so given the size of the audience and the fact that probably at least some of you are pretty familiar with what we wrote already, um, I would suggest that, well, I could start with just going through our report in a little more detail than I did at the Board of Supervisors. Maybe a more efficient way to do this particular presentation is to see at the beginning if there are particular questions that anybody here has that you'd like us to hit, and then I could go straight to those. And if not, I'll just go through our presentation as planned. So if anybody has a question, you should be able to send that into the Q&A tool. And I see there's already a few in there. Let me take a quick look at some of those. Well, some of you think about some questions to put in. Okay, well, I see some of the questions are about the kinds of cases we have and how we're going to prioritize them moving forward. So why don't I just hop straight to that part of the presentation, and we'll do part of that right now. And then I will go back through some other material after that. So forgive me for a sec here while I flip through a couple slides and cut straight to that part. Okay. So I encourage other questions if people want to throw them in the Q&A while we're talking about these slides. This slide is the best we've been able to figure out how to do at IOLERO to communicate several different things about our caseload all at the same time. And I'll explain a few of the points we're trying to make with this slide. Hopefully, these are clear just from looking at them, but I know not everybody is going to appreciate the way we've designed this, nor is it necessarily the case that uh, visual setups like this are necessarily best for everybody. So what we see on this slide is, first of all, a set of red bars. Those are the number of audits we completed every year at IOLERO. And as you can see, those generally track to how many auditors we have working for us at any one time. So you'll notice there's a red bar in the middle for fiscal year 21-22. For most of that year, we had 2 auditors working for us, and we got more audits done at that in that fiscal year than in the others just before or after. In the one before 2021 and also 22-23, we only had 1 auditor. If you look at fiscal year 23-24, we had 2 auditors working for us that year, and our number of audits went significantly up. In 24-25, we lost an auditor, so we had effectively for most of the year 1.5 auditors. That's 1 full-time and 1 part-time, and our number of audits dropped again. So one of the things that this tells us is that in order to keep up with the kinds of caseload we're getting, we do need multiple auditors working at IOLERO. And this upcoming year, we do have right now, 3 full-time auditors and 1 part-time auditor, and we think that's going to be just fine for keeping up with independent investigations and also audits. So one of the questions we got on the Q&A is, how are we going to triage the audit backlog? Well, part of it was just by adding more staff, frankly, so we can move through more audits and more investigations in a given year a lot faster. Now that said, there are a couple other parts of this chart that help answer that question too. You'll notice in the far right column for fiscal year 24-25, we have a small yellow bar, which has to do with investigations completed. We decided to list those separately for a few reasons. One is that Measure P gave IOLERO the power to do direct investigations where we actually could talk to witnesses and gather documents and other evidence ourselves. Um, and that was a power we didn't have prior to Measure P. So those direct investigations are a relatively new feature of IOLERO, and so we wanted to highlight for people in the public that we actually are doing some of the work described in Measure P right there in that yellow bar. We also wanted to pull these out separately from the audits because they just take vastly more time to complete. Um, you might compare it to, say, being an artist versus being an art critic, or being a chef versus being a food reviewer, or being an athlete versus being a referee at a sporting event, right? They're both important roles. They both have complexities. You have to know the subject matter well to do both of them, but it is a lot harder to be the person who's making the product on the front end than the person who's double checking or assessing the product later. Kind of like it's harder to be a student taking a test than it is to be the teacher grading the test. So in this regard, our investigations just take a lot more time and effort, which is why we've been needing more staff so that we can do that. Now, the other thing I want to point out here is the backlog. The question I'm trying to respond here to is how we would triage the backlog. And in addition to just getting more staff, we're also looking at what kinds of cases we have and how many we have. You'll notice the gray bars showing the backlog at any one time got up to a little over 35 in fiscal years 1920 and 2021. And then they went down for a while, which corresponded to us having more auditors and cranking through more audits in fiscal year 21-22. And then in 23-24 and 24-25, that gray bar remained stubbornly high, around 50 cases a year. And part of that's because of the blue line you see here, which is the number of complaints we received at IOLERO. That really skyrocketed in 22-23, and it has remained higher than it ever was prior to that era. So in the last 3 fiscal years, we've just been getting a lot more cases coming in the door than we had before. I can't point to any one reason for that. It may just be that our outreach is more effective. Lizette Camacho does a great job in getting the word out about our services, and so that might be part of it. It could be that just over time, people have become more aware of IOLERO. And it could be that there's just some reason why people want to complain more right now. It's hard for us to identify a reason for that. But the fact of the matter is there are just more complaints coming in and therefore more cases to audit. But also, if you take a look at the green line below, that's a reflection of the number of cases that started at the sheriff's office, did not involve complaints submitted to IOLERO, but still came to IOLERO for audit. Our powers for auditing have expanded the number and kinds of cases that might start at the sheriff's office without a complaint from the public and still go over to IOLERO for auditing. And that number has gone up too, pretty substantially, from 10 or less in the first 3 or 4 years of IOLERO's existence to now, 15 or so a year. That makes a substantial difference because those are often very complicated cases. They're usually ones that we'll talk about here in a minute called administrative reviews, where there was some very dramatic event that happened, like an in-custody death, a death in the course of a vehicle pursuit, someone dying because of a use of force out in the field, or being substantially injured. And so typically those cases have a large number of deputies involved, a lot of different kinds of conduct to assess. And because they're very grave cases, they're ones in which the effect on community was significant, we really want to put a lot of time into those. So all this is to say, part of what we're trying to do with our triage is look at cases according to level of severity. How much did each case affect the public? So if we have one individual case, say, of discourtesy, we're still going to take that seriously. That case is important to the individual who made the complaint. But we're also going to be taking a look at what the effect is on the rest of the community. So cases in which people die, for example, we're going to put more time and effort into. So part of our triage in the next year, this upcoming fiscal year, is going to be to assign the time of the auditors according to the severity or the impact on the public. And so you'll see us putting more time into the kinds of cases you see in these green lines. a little bit less time into certain of the complaints from the public, depending on the severity or the consequence to people out there in the public of those cases. So it's kind of a long answer, but that's what these town halls are designed to do, is give you longer answers. And so that's our plan. Increase staff, which we've accomplished, and then prioritize cases according to their impact on the public. We still think that this upcoming year we're going to be able to move through a lot more audits than we have in the past. And in fact, our audit productivity has already been really good here so far in the first few months of this fiscal year. So we're looking forward to being able to report to you next year that we've really gotten that backlog down, even though the number of cases coming in continues to go up. I'd also note that one reason that we have a fair number of cases in the backlog is that we've already been triaging in the way that I just described. So in this last cycle, if you look through our annual report, you'll notice 8 cases that are older from 2019, 2020, 2021, and 2022. And a lot of those are pretty significant cases. Those are all cases that came to us from the sheriff's office relatively late. Some of them took 4 years, or in other cases, 2 years to investigate. So the 2 cases from 2019 and 2020, for example, one was a civil claim, another was an administrative review of an in-custody death. And those each took about 4 years to get from the sheriff's office over to us at IOLERO. But they're really significant cases, so I'm glad we put time into them. And of course, we prioritized trying to clear those as quickly as we could, as opposed to some other cases, because of the gravity of the allegations involved. You can see the same thing in some of the other cases, not everyone, but most of the cases from 2021 and 2022. We're hopeful that next year we can show you that we've got even more of these cases done. So thanks for bearing with us as we try to make sure our staffing is aligned with our caseload. So another question we had are, what are the kinds of cases we have? And in that regard, I think it might be actually more helpful for me to turn to part of our annual report that discusses that issue a little bit. So give me a moment here to change our screen. Hmm. All right, give me just a second. There we go. Okay, so you should see on your screen a portion of our annual report, which you can find on our website, and it describes here or breaks down a couple different sorts of cases that we take a look at. These categories come from sheriff's office procedures. These are not required by state law. They're not required by local ordinance, but they are a common way of dividing up different kinds of cases depending on where they came from. And sometimes this can be useful in understanding the kinds of cases that we're getting over here at IOLERO. So this particular box shows you the kinds of cases that started at the sheriff's office. That was the green line I was showing you before, that's gone up from 10 to more than 15 cases in a year. And what you'll see here are first administrative reviews. An administrative review means the sheriff's office has come across some kind of issue that they think is worth um, examining really closely. And those are typically ones where something significant has happened, like a death in custody or a shooting. And so, even though there is no complaint from the public about the situation, the sheriff's office takes it upon itself to look into the matter. Now, one of the challenges I think we're having at IOLERO right now is a little bit of a disconnect between the sheriff's office and IOLERO about how thoroughly those incidents should be examined. We're just starting to understand in the last few months that the sheriff's office thinking on these kinds of cases is that if they don't have a complaint, they're just going to do a paper review of the file without interviewing anyone and see if they see anything that looks like a problem. Our concern at IOLERO is that with these kinds of administrative reviews, the issues that are being addressed are so significant and so serious that really there ought to be interviews of the personnel involved. In most jobs, if something happened at work with a really major consequence, like someone dying or being injured, you'd probably expect that your boss is going to want to talk to you about what happened. And there's probably going to be a written report about it. And we think that same basic rule of thumb applies here. In most major law enforcement agencies, all the personnel involved are interviewed, not necessarily to tell them they did something wrong, although that does sometimes happen, but mostly to find out what it is that those members of the agency can tell management about what happened, what went well, what didn't go well, what kinds of training or policies might be helpful in the future to address that kind of situation to create a better result. Um, it's come to our attention that the current culture in the sheriff's office is that those administrative review kinds of cases really shouldn't have interviews unless someone in management has decided that someone in the sheriff's office has done wrong already, just from looking at whatever paper records there are or video there are of the situation. And we think that creates a culture in which people inside the sheriff's office then are going to feel that if they're asked to explain what happened, that they are being told that they've done something wrong. It's kind of like being called to the principal's office, right? It has become necessarily a negative if someone is called in to talk about these kinds of incidents. And we think that's an unhealthy culture for both accountability, but also making sure that policy and procedure are always top notch. It eliminates an opportunity for employees who are in significant situations to give feedback to management about how they could have been better prepared, better assisted, how their tools could be better, or how policies and training did not perform as expected. That's a really important feedback loop when significant consequences occur. And we need that here in Sonoma County so we can make sure that we minimize the number of times people die in custody or killed at the hands of sheriffs, even if everyone in the incident who works for the county performed exactly as expected. So these administrative reviews are some of the most complicated and uh, detailed cases that we end up auditing. Another set are what are called internal affairs cases. These are cases where someone in the sheriff's office concluded that there's a concern about an employee inside the sheriff's office. So it could be a supervisor, for example, who's flagging an issue and bringing it to the attention of management about one of their subordinates. And so these tend to be pretty significant cases too. It suggests that at least someone in the sheriff's office thought there was a substantial problem and brought it to the attention of management with a specific allegation of misconduct to investigate. So these cases tend to be fairly serious and complicated as well. Um, the policy and procedure cases tend to be spin-offs from the administrative review cases. So where an administrative review finds that there's a problem that needs to be fixed or could be better, then a new case, given a PP number, policy and procedure case, is generated by the sheriff's office. So sometimes these are actually related to the same facts as the administrative reviews, but involve an individual or individuals that the sheriff's office wants to take a closer look at. They can be as modest as simply flagging that someone needs to be retrained or needs to have a rule explained to them a little bit more clearly. And they can also be more substantial cases. So these vary in their complexity. Some are very simple very isolated, some are much more complicated. Finally, we have these citizen complaint cases, or C. These are instances where someone in the public went to the sheriff's office to make a complaint about a sheriff's office employee, as opposed to that person coming to IOLERO to make a complaint. So these are really the same kinds of complaints we get at IOLERO. And in that regard, pretty much everything that comes through IOLERO and goes over to internal affairs gets the same designation, citizen complaint, or C. So if you added to this set of 17 here, the cases that came from IOLERO, you'd see the citizen complaint number would be vastly larger, right? So this particular chart are just the cases coming from the sheriff's office. I think it's interesting to note that there are still people in the public who take their complaints directly to the sheriff's office, and they're entitled to do that. They don't have to go to IOLERO, but we still audit those even though they went to the sheriff's office first. So I hope that helps explain a little bit the backlog and the kinds of cases that we have. Let me turn for just a second here to the Q&A. All right. One of the other issues I'd like to talk about, because it's been asked about, are some of the kinds of uh, policy trends that we noted in our annual report presentation at the Board of Supervisors, but didn't have a lot of time to dig into. And those are towards the tail end of the presentation we made. Give me a moment and I'll switch to that screen. Okay, these were 5 different observations that we made about issues that came up in audits repeatedly over this last fiscal year. And I want to talk about each of them briefly, and I invite you to throw some questions into the Q&A if you want to get into these in any more detail. The first one is about evictions. Now, in this past cycle, we did take a look at a number of cases that came in from people who had been evicted. And that's a little bit new for us because over the course of the pandemic, evictions were, this is an oversimplification, but as a general rule, there was a moratorium on most evictions for a period of time during COVID and the years following. And those moratoria ended over the last year and a half or so. So we started seeing complaints about evictions only just in the last um, year or two. And we tried to summarize as best we could some of the issues that we saw in those eviction cases. So for the sheriff's office, they tend to get involved in evictions in 2 different ways, mostly. One is that a landlord and a tenant end up in court talking to a judge about what to do about a tenant not paying rent or in some other way violating the terms of the lease such that the law allows them to be evicted. And in this first category of cases, only after the court has made a decision and had an opportunity at least to hear from the tenant, does the court then make an order evicting the tenant. So there's already been a process. There's been court proceedings, there's been opportunity to have representation, there's been opportunity for the tenant to tell their side of the story. And we've reached the end of that process where the judge has said, hey, after hearing all the facts, this tenant needs to leave this particular housing. And in that case, then the sheriff is uniquely positioned among all law enforcement agencies for enforcing that rule. So then the sheriff goes out and enforces the judge's order in that regard, shows up at the residence, makes sure the tenant is out. In a lot of those cases, the tenant has already left, and because, of course, they've been through this court proceeding and they know that eviction is coming. In a few cases, the tenant is still there, and sometimes we get complaints from the tenants and even sometimes the landlords about how the sheriff handles the cases um, during that part of the process. Now, this is, of course, a time of high emotion for everybody involved and significant consequence. So it's understandable that people would find that process upsetting, difficult, stressful, frustrating, and tempers can get pretty hot. So when we have seen complaints about that part of the eviction process, generally we've noticed that the core challenge that's going on are those heightened emotions and big consequences going on at the time of the eviction. We have not seen any misconduct by sheriff's deputies during those evictions. So that's a positive. We do find that not everybody who's going through that eviction process seems to understand what's happening or why it's happening. And that's a substantial issue that I think we could be working on a little bit more here in the county of Sonoma. We could have a little bit more information, a little more detail that we could provide to people who are being evicted about services that they could use during that time, about why the process has gotten to the point that it has, and maybe to provide them with not just housing services, but other closely related services. In some instances, there are people who are not documented and they might need some immigration assistance, or there are people with mental health issues who might need some mental health assistance, or they're in economic distress and could use some of the county and the state's other services around, say, Section 8 housing vouchers to help with paying the rent. And we think we could do a better job as a county of getting information to people who are being evicted in that moment. So that's one thing that we suggested that the sheriff's office could perhaps work on, since they're the face of the county effectively during the process. Now, another thing that we um, took a look at were the way that domestic violence and elder abuse cases are handled. We happen to have an unusual number of those, not terribly huge, but enough that we noticed the pattern in this past cycle. Um, we noted two cases in which we thought that there was this challenge between the mm, legitimate law enforcement goals, in a domestic violence or elder abuse situation, making sure everyone's safe, making sure that everyone who could potentially be an abuser is at least under some control by law enforcement during the initial response by law enforcement. And in those situations, sometimes there's some mental health overlap too. It could be that some of the people involved might need some mental health assistance. And we thought that in each of the cases we looked at, there could be a little bit more training for some of the sheriff's deputies about when to consider using a mental health hold or to get mental health services, as opposed to just uh, treating the situation as one where there's, intentional violence by someone who's committing domestic violence or elder abuse. And that might sound a little vague, but I think one can imagine ways in which, if a deputy sheriff shows up to a hostile or tense situation, um, using a very traditional law enforcement response of having a large command presence, issuing loud orders, taking command, as it were, is quite different than using de-escalation strategies to talk someone down who's in a mental health crisis. And knowing which one to use is sometimes challenging. So we thought there could be some improvement made there. A third issue that we saw were sheriff's office comments on pending investigations. Um, this is an issue that's come up in a number of different fiscal years, but we also thought it was appropriate to answer here. Um, in some of the cases we've looked at in the past, we've noticed that the sheriff's office has this pressure to get out to the public some information about high profile incidents, whether it's a deputy involved shooting or a case that happens to attract a lot of media attention. Could be a criminal investigation, say about a homicide or some other issue that's urgent or pressing. And where there are allegations that sheriff's deputies did wrong in those cases, sometimes the pressure to get some information out to the public about the case and the importance of taking a close look very cautiously at the conduct of deputies comes into conflict. It is often not satisfactory to the public to say we're still investigating what our people did and we will get back to the public when we have more answers. And that's understandably a difficult thing to tell the public in certain situations. But we think that's really important. And we did notice that some years ago, the sheriff's office was using a PR firm to put together videos about some of these critical incidents. And in those videos, sometimes the details appeared to attempt to justify behavior of deputies that was actually still under investigation. And so our recommendation to the sheriff's office is just don't do that. That might be easier said than done, but we also think it's very important to make sure to communicate to the public that the sheriff's office is keeping an open mind about whether there might be some kind of misconduct in those kinds of cases. A fourth one had to do with cooperation trends. In the last fiscal year, we saw some positives and some negatives. We saw much greater cooperation with the Community Advisory Council in this last cycle than we had seen in previous cycles. And we really appreciated that. I know the Community Advisory Council did too. And you can see some of the fruits of that cooperation in this other screen I'm going to share with you, which is our current website. So if you go to our main website and you go to this tab here, the Community Advisory Council tab, click on that and then go to CAC Reports and Recommendations, you can see some of the fruits of that collaboration. In particular, we have here a canine letter that the CAC finished in 2025. It has to do with changes to the canine policy. And I thought that was an excellent piece of work. And the sheriff's office adopted many, but not all, of the recommendations in that letter. And that came as a result of the sheriff himself and many of his staff being willing to spend time talking to CAC members about canine practice and training, and even had some of us attend a canine training, at least one, so we could see a little bit of how that works. That level of cooperation hasn't always been present at the sheriff's office, but it sure was in 24-25, and that helped us out a lot. Another is this September of 2024 ad hoc report on recruitment, hiring, and retention. This was a product that the CAC put together to convey to the sheriff's office some recommendations and also some praise about the sheriff's office work in 2023 and 2024 to fill some consistent vacancies that the sheriff's office had in their staff. Now, this was a problem in a lot of law enforcement agencies during that time. And here, based on conversations between Sheriff Ingram and others at the sheriff's office, the CAC was able to come up with some recommendations about how better to hire a diverse staff, make sure to retain them, how to make law enforcement a more appealing profession for women, and also some recommendations about keeping extremists who might be looking to use law enforcement to actually subvert our system of laws out of law enforcement. And so that was some excellent work. Can also see here in both English and in Spanish our the CAC's March 2025 report about RIPA data, and what we can see from the RIPA data here in Sonoma County. It's a complicated and detailed report. I really appreciated the expertise that went into that and the tremendous effort that the CAC members put into thinking about it. They made some recommendations to the sheriff's office about how the sheriff's office could better collect and then retain and analyze the data that comes from RIPA about who the sheriff's office is stopping and why. And the sheriff's office has been willing to adopt some of those recommendations, which I think is a plus. In addition to that, the RIPA report, I think, pointed out correctly that we do still have really significant disparities in Sonoma County, as we see in almost all jurisdictions in California, between who lives in the area, according to census data, and who is stopped by law enforcement. And as you might imagine, those stops are disproportionately of people of color. And I think we are still trying to figure out exactly why that is statewide, and Sonoma is no exception. So there's some really great material in there. That could be a whole nother webinar, about an hour and a half easily. So I definitely recommend you take a look at that. All of these products came about in part because the sheriff's office was willing to talk, share thoughts, share data, and be in conversation with the CAC. Now, a significant portion of those three accomplishments was also that we had CAC members who were really willing to dig in and do the work to get to understand some complicated issues and put together some thoughtful reports. So they deserve a lot of praise too. It's definitely a two-way street. So that was an improvement. A downside we had, this last year in terms of cooperation, and in this regard, I'm talking about the last fiscal year and the last few months, was very specifically about how the sheriff's office would cooperate in whistleblower cases. And as I think many of you know, on this cooperations trend, fourth point here, one of our downsides was we did end up in conflict with the sheriff's office about whether they would provide to us material about whistleblower cases. They took the position that the way that the letters of agreement are drafted that implement Measure P, that we're not able to get to whistleblower cases and investigate them. We think that's incorrect. That matter is still in litigation, and we're hoping for a decision from the state appellate court, the first appellate division, sometime later this fiscal year, probably in the spring of 2026. And that we think will let us know whether we really can or cannot investigate whistleblower cases moving forward. A core issue there is whether one sees the letters of agreement that were negotiated in 2021 and 2022 to implement Measure P, which of course passed in 2020, whether those letters overwrite Measure P and are therefore the controlling document, or whether Measure P controls and those letters simply supplement or fill in some gaps in Measure P. The advice we've been getting consistently here at IOLERO has been that the letters of agreement just fill in the gaps. A consistent refrain we are now hearing from folks at the sheriff's office is no. Actually, the way those letters work is that they overwrite or control over Measure P, such that if there's something in Measure P that's not repeated in the letters, it's effectively deleted. And so we obviously disagree with that, but you can see how that would create a radically different set of procedures for IOLERO, depending on which one you think is right. So this answers a little bit some of the other questions we've been asked, like how are we going to move forward on some of our more complicated cases, like independent investigations and whistleblower cases. And I think the answer to that in the medium term is we really need to see what the appellate court says about this litigation about whistleblower cases. That's going to answer a lot of our other questions about whether we can or cannot investigate some of these other more important, some of the most important, most difficult cases. Last item I wanted to get into here a little bit is just to let people know that most of our reports have a section that talk about SB 1421 and SB 16, which are sections of the state penal code that relate to how it is that some of these investigations and audits are made public. Very few of them can be, but in California now a few can be. We did not have any such cases in this last fiscal year, so I just want people to understand that the fact that you don't see super detailed rendition of our cases is not a policy decision of ours. It's just an application of state law. State law doesn't allow us to make some of our cases more public in the way that we would really like to. And so we have made these cases as transparent as is currently allowed by law. In some future years, we might have the ability to make some of our cases a little bit more public. We don't have that in this particular set. We do continue on our website to have a section where we make available to the public the cases we can make available to the public. And I'll share that with you in just a moment. So as you'll see in the screen sharing, this is our IOLERO main webpage. And if you take a look at this one, there's of course a section on annual reports, which you've just been looking at, but also this section on audits and investigations. Click there, and it takes you to this page that has the complete report and most of the supporting materials for each of the independent investigations that we've done in the past. And there are quite a few here, most of them, though, released in other years than this one. The David Pelaez Chavez case is one that we'll be talking about in the next annual report. The other ones you see here are from previous annual reports. So you'll continue to see more here over time. We just happen not to have any that qualified. In that regard, it's important to note an interesting wrinkle in the law this last year. The in-custody death cases that we looked at in this last year are now subject to a state law that makes the sheriff's office investigation into those cases public, but does not allow IOLERO to make our version of those investigations public. This is, I think, probably an oversight by the legislature. There was a strong push to make investigations into in-custody deaths public, and that push succeeded with a piece of legislation that talks about the agency's investigation. And I think at the time that that piece of legislation went through, folks just didn't put together that the oversight agency's investigations weren't listed there. That could be a legislative improvement in the future. But for that reason, you will not see the in-custody deaths here on our website. You may be able to get those from the sheriff's office if you check in with them. That's a regrettable part of our current public access regime here in California. I would love to be able to present those cases to you in great detail so you could see our full report, understand our logic, and maybe even take a look at some of the materials we looked at to reach our conclusion. But we're not able to do that right now. So we don't have those for you. Let me switch to a different topic real quick. And again, if you have any other Q&As, feel free to put them in there. I only have a couple more that I haven't gotten to yet. Okay. One of the questions I've been asked is about the 8th and 14th Amendment standards for how people are treated when they're in custody. This gets complicated really fast, but since I had a question about it, I'll try my best to give a short answer, which will necessarily be probably not detailed enough for some listeners. So please bear with me when we understand this is a slight oversimplification. In the jail cases you see in our report, there are a number of different ways in which we assess how people in jail are treated. And the two main ways in which we assess those in the US is that if someone is incarcerated in a jail and they have not been found guilty yet, we use one test, which comes from the 4th and 14th Amendments that has to do with how a person is treated when they're in custody but not yet convicted of a crime. And this is, again, a really broad oversimplification, but I think a decent way to treat that is people who are incarcerated while they're waiting for trial are supposed to be left in roughly the same condition they would be if they weren't in custody, except for the fact that their freedom of movement is impaired. If, on the other hand, they are incarcerated because they have actually been convicted, then a different provision of the Constitution applies. That's the 8th Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. And that's a slightly different standard. Part of that standard goes to how people are treated when they're in custody in terms of how exactly they're punished, right? Like, can they suffer corporal punishment, for example, in the US? The answer is generally no, unless you just see being confined in a cell as some kind of corporal punishment. Um, they are supposed to be given medical attention while they're incarcerated, but only to the extent that the people doing the incarceration are not deliberately indifferent to the safety of the people who are incarcerated. That's what you might call a lower standard, meaning that in those kinds of cases, the um, sorry, someone was asking me something on the side there. So in those kinds of cases, that lower standard, the Eighth Amendment standard, sometimes results in a lower standard of care or less attention to the prisoner than you might see with someone who has not yet been convicted. And so we try as best we can to make sure we're assessing whether someone has already been convicted or not when we're double checking whether the treatment that they have been given, medical treatment, or just how they've been treated as a human being, their access to food and clothing and heating and the like, complies with which of those two standards. As a general rule, the jail tries to comply with the higher standard that applies to everybody who has not yet been convicted of a crime. And in that regard, I think they do a pretty good job. That's the safer, smarter way to do it because they have prisoners who have both situations. And they don't have to do it that way. They could separate out the people who have already been convicted and give them less access to resources, for example, in certain ways, less programming, for example. They generally don't do that in the jail, and I think that's a positive. So, at any rate, highly complicated issue, but I got a question about it and I want to try to answer it. If there's anyone who has not yet put a question in the chat, I would say please feel free to do that. This is a good time. Um, there was at least one question about how to get access to the CAC meeting from um, last week, which is really not part of this presentation, but since you're being asked, you can find that on our website. Just go to the CAC meeting dated November 12th, where the agendas are displayed. Also, the calendar function on our website shows that too. Do we have some other questions from anyone who's online with us? Okay. Another set of questions that we got here in the Q&A has to do with how does IOLERO move forward on independent investigations, given some of the comments we've been having or conversations we've been having in the public over the last month or so about how we interview some sheriff's deputies. I know that's a question people really want to get into, and I appreciate that. I'm not going to cover that tonight, only because, well, for two reasons, really. One is that was an issue that we didn't cover in this most recent annual report, and this presentation is supposed to be about that annual report. But secondarily, that's a complicated issue we're still working on, so I don't think I have anything new or different to share today than I've shared in some other meetings in the last couple of months. So I think that's everything we have on that issue this time, but I do anticipate that'll be a very substantial part of our next annual report, and I'm sure you'll be hearing more from us about that over the next 6 to 8 months. The end result of our appellate case about whistleblower subpoena litigation will be an important factor there. Lizette, did you see any other questions that maybe I am missing?
No, but I did answer the one about how to get to the CAC recording also.
Okay, great. And did we have anyone who took advantage of the translation we were offering?
No.
Okay, great. I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing any questions in Spanish. Let me cover just a couple other broader points and then we'll wrap this up. Another thing I wanted to talk about briefly is where we get our cases and how many we actually get over a period of time. So I'm going to share with you again part of our PowerPoint. question that we get a lot from the public, but also from the sheriff's office is, um, why is it that the sheriff's office gets so many cases, from IOLERO? And there are some reasons for that. Um, One is if you go back to the slide about our caseload, we have tracked on this slide what we're calling in this one complaints received at IOLERO about sheriff's office employees. That's the blue line um, that we see here that went up a lot in 2022, 2023, and remains high even now in 24, 25 compared to prior years. Now, when we talk about the set of complaints, these are the times when someone has contacted IOLERO and we have passed their complaint on to the sheriff's office for investigation. You'll notice, say, in 23, 24, we had 31 of those. In 24, 25, we had 44 of those. Now, those 44 cases in the most recent uh, fiscal year that we reported onto the sheriff's office was only a small slice of the total contacts we had from the public in which people were trying to complain about something. So we had in the last fiscal year over 150 people contact us because they wanted to talk to us about some complaint or concern that they had. Of those 150 people, we concluded that a little over 20 of them actually had a complaint about a different law enforcement agency, and we sent them to whichever law enforcement agency that was. Sometimes that's the California Highway Patrol, sometimes it's the Santa Rosa Police Department or the Petaluma Police Department. In all of those cases, we're able to determine that those people were really complaining about someone other than the sheriff. We don't have the ability at IOLERO to handle those complaints. It's not part of our legal mandate. So we pass those complaints on to those agencies and make sure those complainants get in touch with them. So we screen out anything that we can affirmatively figure out doesn't involve the sheriff's office. Sometimes people just don't know what agency they were interacting with, and it takes a little bit of investigation to figure that out. We can't do that investigation at IOLERO. The sheriff's office has to do that, and so we pass those on to the sheriff's office. And so with a small number of cases, they conclude that the complainant was really talking about some other law enforcement agency, or at least they can't identify any sheriff's office personnel involved. We also get, out of those 150 contacts, some of them are complaints about other agencies altogether. Sometimes they're complaints about the courts, or about lawyers, or about county probation. And so in those cases, we try to pass those concerns on to those other places. Um, of those complaints, then roughly only a little less than a third of the contacts we get end up being complaints we send to the sheriff's office, and that's where this 44 number comes from. So rest assured, there's substantial screening that happens at IOLERO of all these contacts before we send anyone to the sheriff's office to have their case investigated over at the sheriff's office. Now, in addition to that, of these 44, a fair number of those end up being concerns about the terms and conditions of confinement. That's a term of art. It means how people are treated in the jail as a general rule. So I'll give you an example. If someone says, hey, a sheriff's deputy hit me with a baton the other day for no reason, we would take that as a complaint about a personnel misbehaving, and we'd expect the sheriff's office to investigate it and return an investigation back to us. If someone said to us, my cell is normally too cold and the food is inadequate at the jail, well, those are important concerns, but they're not necessarily about the misconduct of one particular individual at the sheriff's office. So state law requires that those be treated as what's called a grievance. Grievance is a system for complaining about the conditions at the jail as opposed to an individual member of the jail staff misbehaving. Those go through a specific grievance process run by the jail, and we have the ability to take a look at how that grievance system is working, but we generally don't audit each individual grievance in the same way that we do complaints about individual sheriff's deputies. So in this particular year, of those 44 complaints received, 18 of them became grievances, and that also helps set up the prisoner who's making the complaint to be able to sue about that issue if they want or need to. Not that we're necessarily encouraging that, but it is the case that if one wants to sue over terms and conditions of confinement, you have to show as a prisoner that you took advantage of the grievance system first. So by doing that, not only are we following state law, but we're also making sure we're protecting the rights of prisoners. Of those 18 cases we had in fiscal year 24-25, we double checked the sheriff's office determination of whether they were appropriately routing things to grievances or not. We only had one case in which we initially disagreed about whether a case should be a grievance or a complaint against personnel. And when we did have that one disagreement, it worked out in the way that we wanted it to. And ultimately, the sheriff's office investigated the matter. So we think that system is actually working pretty well. And so for those who are concerned about how people are treated in the jail, that's one way the system works to make sure those grievances go to the right place. Some years ago, IOLERO did an audit of that grievance system to make sure it was working correctly. We haven't done that again recently, but that might be a good thing for us to do in the next couple of years. So that's a lot, but I think I've answered all the questions in the chat, and those also cover most of the issues that I was interested in covering tonight in more detail. Maybe we'll give people just a moment here to see if there's anything else they want to put into the Q&A if they want before we wrap up for the evening. All right, well, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I think we'll wrap up this town hall in just a moment or two. I do want people to know that one of the things we'll be doing this year to get the annual report out a little bit more effectively is to create small cards, like a business card with a QR code on it that will take one to the annual report so we can get the annual report out into the hands of more people electronically when we're out and about um, in, uh, in the community doing our outreach events. We have gotten some feedback that the reports are kind of heavy. So we're trying to figure out more effective ways to get people linked up to those reports without them having to carry around a thick tome. We continue to try to make sure these are available at local libraries. And in addition to that, online, it's in English and Spanish now, online, and also in a format that's accessible to people with a variety of disabilities so that they can still access all that information, even if they have impairments that prevent them from going through a PDF the way many other people would. If any of you have feedback about how we can do a better job of getting this information out to the public, we'd love to hear it. Please do feel free to send that in to us. And thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us tonight. Lizette, did you have anything else you think we need to offer tonight before we wrap up?
Nope, that's it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for your time and attention tonight. I know it's a lot of detail, but I really appreciate the questions and the conversation. Thanks so much.